June 5, 1944, 11:45 p.m., over the English Channel. The air inside the C-47 Skytrain is thick, a suffocating cocktail of high-octane fuel fumes, vomit, and the metallic tang of oiled Thompson submachine guns. Outside the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage, the night is an absolute, terrifying void. Below, the English Channel churns with the largest armada in human history. But for the 18 men hooked to the static line, the world has shrunk to the width of a jump door. Across the fields of Normandy, German officers of the 91st Luftland Division sit in requisitioned chateaus, drinking French wine and laughing at the thought of an Allied invasion during such a storm. They believe the soft Americans are miles away, tucked into their barracks in England, waiting for the weather to clear. They are wrong. High above the clouds, the red light glows. The wind howls through the open door, screaming at 120 miles per hour. 1,000 silhouettes are about to plummet into the darkness, turning the quiet French countryside into a graveyard for the Third Reich's arrogance. The laughter is about to stop. By the early months of 1944, the Third Reich's leadership viewed the impending Allied invasion not with dread, but with a certain sense of predatory anticipation. To the veteran commanders of the Wehrmacht, men who had bled in the frozen trenches of Stalingrad and commanded blitzkriegs across the European continent, the United States Army was an unknown, unproven quantity. To them, the American soldier was a product of a pampered, democratic society. They were soft, civilians in uniform, more interested in chocolate and jazz than the grim, disciplined reality of total war. The German High Command, particularly under the influence of Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine, had cultivated a narrative of superiority. They saw the United States as a nation of assembly lines, not warriors. While they respected American industrial output, they fundamentally doubted the American spirit. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief in the West, looked at the maps of the Atlantic Wall and saw a fortress that no amateur army could hope to breach. This wall was not just a series of bunkers. It was a psychological monument to German invincibility. From the tip of Norway down to the Spanish border, the coast was bristling with millions of mines, jagged steel hedgehogs, and the formidable Rommel's asparagus. Massive wooden poles driven into the fields to impale gliders and crush paratroopers. The Germans believed that even if the Allies managed to scramble onto the beaches, they would be pinned down by the sheer weight of fire from the concrete strongpoints. In the chateaux and command posts of Normandy, the atmosphere among the German officer corps was often one of relaxed superiority. Many of the divisions stationed in the quiet sectors of France were bodenständig, static divisions composed of older men or those recovering from wounds on the Eastern Front. They spent their days drilling, and their evenings enjoying the luxuries of occupied France. They were so confident in the weather and the Channel's natural defenses that on the night of June 5th, many high-ranking commanders, including Erwin Rommel himself, were away from the front. Rommel was in Germany for his wife's birthday, convinced that the stormy seas made an invasion impossible. The German officers laughed at the idea of the green Americans attempting a landing in a gale. They expected a slow, methodical buildup that their intelligence would catch weeks in advance. They did not expect the sky to open up. They did not expect that while they slept, thousands of highly trained, motivated, and heavily armed Americans were already in the air, flying low over the waves to bypass the wall entirely and strike at the very heart of their backyard. While the German High Command rested on the laurels of past victories, a new breed of soldier was being forged in the red clay of Georgia. To the Germans, the American was a civilian. To the U.S. Army, the volunteer paratrooper was the answer to the stalemate of the Atlantic Wall. The birth of the American airborne was not merely a military expansion. It was a radical experiment in human endurance. At Camp Toccoa, under the shadow of Currahee Mountain, the men of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and thousands like them in the 82nd and 101st Divisions, were pushed to the absolute breaking point. Their training was designed to weed out the softness the Germans so frequently mocked. These men ran 3 miles up and 3 miles down Currahee, often in full combat gear, until their lungs burned and their boots filled with blood. They were trained to be autonomous, to operate behind enemy lines without a traditional front line, and to thrive in the chaos of the night. Every man was taught every job. A private was expected to know how to lead a platoon, and a radio operator was expected to know how to set a demolition charge. By the time these divisions arrived in the staging areas of southern England in early 1944, they had been transformed into an elite strike force. The Screaming Eagles of the 101st and the All-Americans of the 82nd were no longer the disorganized amateurs the Wehrmacht imagined. They were arguably the most heavily armed and fit infantrymen in the world. Each man carried a staggering load of equipment: an M1 Garand or Thompson submachine gun, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, grenades, a combat knife, a cricket clicker for identification, landmines, and even a small escape kit with a compass and silk map. The strategic goal was as audacious as the training was brutal. The Allied planners knew that if the infantry landing on Utah and Omaha beaches were to survive, the German reinforcements inland had to be stopped. The paratroopers were the scalpel meant to cut the tendons of the German defense. They were to drop into the dark, seize the vital causeways through the flooded marshes behind the beaches, and destroy the artillery batteries that could rain death on the landing craft. As the sun set on June 5th, the marshalling areas in England became silent. General Dwight D. Eisenhower visited the men of the 101st, his face etched with the weight of the gamble. He knew the tactical projections. Some commanders feared casualty rates as high as 75%. Yet, as he looked into the blackened faces of the paratroopers, he didn't see the fear of soft men. He saw a cold, quiet determination. These men were the spearhead of democracy, and they were about to be thrust directly into the backyard of the master race. To understand how the soft Americans achieved what the German High Command deemed impossible, one must look at the intersection of tactical audacity and technological ingenuity. The American airborne didn't just jump. They brought with them a specialized arsenal designed to solve the unique problem of being surrounded from the moment they hit the earth. The most critical piece of technology was the C-47 Skytrain, the Dakota. While the Germans relied on the slower, less reliable Junkers Ju-52, the C-47 was a rugged workhorse capable of delivering 18 men and their gear into a tight drop zone at 120 miles per hour. It was the backbone of the vertical envelopment, a concept the Germans had pioneered in Crete, but which the Americans had now industrialized on a massive scale. Tactically, the problem was identification in the dark. Dropping thousands of men into the French hedgerows, a labyrinth of thick, ancient stone and earth walls topped with dense vegetation, meant that units would be instantly scattered. To solve this, the Americans issued a deceptively simple device, the cricket. This small brass and steel clicker allowed a lone paratrooper to signal in the dark. One click-clack required a click-clack, click-clack in response. It was a low-tech solution to a high-stakes problem, allowing men who had never met to form LGOPs, little groups of officers and privates. These ad hoc units became the tactical nightmare of the German defenders. Because the Americans were everywhere, the Germans believed they were being attacked by an army much larger than it actually was. Technologically, the American paratrooper was a walking arsenal. Unlike the German Fallschirmjäger, who often jumped with only a pistol and had to find weapon canisters on the ground, the American T-5 parachute system allowed GIs to jump with their primary weapons strapped to their bodies. The Griswold bag protected the disassembled M1 Garand, meaning that within seconds of landing, an American paratrooper was a fully lethal combatant. They also carried the M1A1 folding stock carbine, designed specifically for airborne use, and the devastating Gammon bomb, a plastic explosive grenade that could disable a panzer if thrown with enough nerve. The Germans had built the Atlantic Wall to face the sea, but they had left their backyard tactically naked. They relied on the flooded marshes of the Murderette and Douve rivers to act as a natural barrier, believing no soldier could navigate the waist-deep, freezing waters in the middle of the night. The Americans, however, turned this geography against them. By utilizing pathfinders, specialized teams who jumped 30 minutes early to set up Eureka beacons and holophane lights, the Allies attempted to guide the air armada into the heart of the German rear. Even when the beacons failed and the clouds caused chaos, the technological edge of American radio equipment and the tactical flexibility of the individual paratrooper ensured that the soft Americans remained a cohesive threat, while the German chain of command remained paralyzed in the dark. The clash in Normandy was not just one of steel and technology, but a profound collision of two military philosophies. In the German camp, leadership was defined by Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. Yet by 1944, this had been strangled by Hitler's refusal to allow any retreat and a rigid, top-heavy chain of command that required his personal permission to move armored reserves. On the night of the drop, the German leadership was effectively headless. General Wilhelm Falle, commander of the 91st Air Landing Division, was caught in an ambush and killed by paratroopers while rushing back to his headquarters. The very officers who had mocked American softness now found themselves unable to order a single counterattack because they couldn't reach their superiors, who were either asleep or miles away from the front. In contrast, the American leadership model shifted to the shoulders of the individual. When the paratroopers were scattered across miles of French countryside, often miles from their intended drop zones, the mission did not fail. It evolved. General Matthew Ridgway and General Maxwell Taylor, commanders of the 82nd and 101st respectively, found themselves on the ground with nothing but a pistol and a handful of privates. There was no softness in the way these West Point-educated officers crawled through drainage ditches to find their men. The American human perspective was one of radical adaptability. If a private found himself alone, his leadership training kicked in, and he began cutting phone lines, sabotaging bridges, and hunting German patrols. The human cost of this gamble was felt most acutely in the minutes before the jump. These were men like those of Easy Company, who had spent years preparing for a single night. The psychological weight was immense. They were jumping into a country where they didn't speak the language, into a landscape of hedgerows that acted as natural fortresses for the enemy. Every shadow was a potential MG-42 nest. The soft Americans were, in reality, teenagers from the Midwest and New York who had been hardened into stoics. They sat in the dark plains, some praying, some vomiting, some sharpening their knives for the third time, knowing that within the hour they would be the most isolated soldiers on the planet. This human element, the sheer nerve to step out of a moving plane into a barrage of green tracer fire, is what the German intelligence had failed to quantify. They had measured American trucks and tanks, but they had not measured the spirit of the volunteer. While German officers waited for orders that would never come, the American paratrooper was already at work. This disparity in leadership, centralized and paralyzed on the Axis side, decentralized and aggressive on the Allied side, turned the backyard of the Atlantic Wall into a maze of localized German defeats that would eventually compromise the entire coastal defense. The clock struck midnight on June 6, 1944, and the air over the Cotentin Peninsula ignited. For the 13,000 paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, the climax did not begin with a heroic charge, but with a terrifying descent into a kaleidoscope of fire. As the C-47s crossed the French coastline, they were met by a wall of German flak that defied description. The sky was no longer dark. It was illuminated by the rhythmic, sickening glow of green and red tracers. The pilots, many of them flying their first combat mission, were forced to break formation as the flak tore through the wings of the Dakotas. The carefully planned drop zones became a fantasy. Inside the planes, the green light flickered on prematurely. Men were flung out into 120 mph winds at altitudes as low as 400 feet, far too low for a standard deployment. Some hit the ground in seconds. Others drifted for what felt like an eternity through a storm of machine gun fire directed upward from the German backyard. This was the moment of peak chaos. The Germans on the ground were waking up to a nightmare they couldn't comprehend. In the village of St. Miraglais, a house had caught fire from a stray flare, and the townspeople were out in the streets forming a bucket brigade. Suddenly, the sky above them filled with white silk. One by one, the American paratroopers began to rain down, not in neat, organized units, but in a chaotic, scattered deluge. Private John Steele famously became snagged on the steeple of the St. Miraglais church, dangling helplessly while the battle raged below him. He watched as his fellow paratroopers were shot before they even touched the soil. But for every man caught in a tree or drowned in the flooded marshes of the Murderette, 10 more were hitting the ground and disappearing into the shadows. The German officers, initially dismissing the reports as a small-scale diversion, were suddenly receiving frantic calls from every sector. The Americans are in the garden. The Americans have seized the bridge. The Americans are everywhere. The very geography the Germans had relied upon, the flooded fields, became a watery grave for some, but for others it became a cloak. The Americans were wet, shivering, and separated from their heavy weapons. but they were moving with a predatory speed. The soft army had arrived, and they were beginning to cut the throat of the German communications network before the first sun of D-Day could even rise. As the clock ticked toward 3 o'clock a.m., the scattered chaos began to solidify into a coordinated assault. The focal point of this resistance was the small, strategic crossroads town of St. Miraglais. It sat directly on the N13 highway, the main artery the Germans would need to move their panzers toward the beaches. While the German garrison, part of the 91st Division, was busy trying to extinguish fires and shooting at silhouettes in the sky, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Cross and his men of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment were quietly gathering in the dark. By 4 o'clock a.m., the soft Americans did something the German High Command thought impossible. They launched a disciplined, urban assault after a night of total dispersal. Cross's men moved like ghosts through the stone streets, using their crickets to signal and their knives to silence sentries. Within an hour, they had raised the American flag over the town hall. St. Miraglais became the first town in France to be liberated, and more importantly, the Germans had lost their primary line of communication. Simultaneously, to the east, the screaming eagles of the 101st were fighting a different kind of war in the hedgerows. Their objective was to clear the exits, the 4 narrow causeways that led from Utah Beach through the flooded marshes. If these exits weren't held, the 4th Infantry Division landing at dawn would be slaughtered on the sand, trapped by the water. At Brecourt Manor, Lieutenant Richard Winters led a small group of paratroopers in a textbook assault against a battery of German 105 guns that were zeroed in on the beach. Using speed, high-volume fire, and tactical aggression, the Americans destroyed the battery, proving that even a handful of amateurs could dismantle a fortified German position. The German response was a disaster of hesitation. Local commanders, terrified of Hitler's no retreat order and lacking clear intelligence, refused to launch a full-scale counterattack. They believed the paratroopers were merely a screen for a larger force, or perhaps even a ruse. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon at 5 o'clock a.m., the German backyard was no longer theirs. The bridges were blown, the telephone lines were cut, and the soft Americans were dug into the earth, waiting for the German reinforcements with a cold, professional lethality. The laughter of the officer corps had been replaced by a frantic, desperate realization. The Atlantic Wall had been bypassed from above, and the Green Army was now holding the keys to the continent. As the first gray light of dawn broke over Normandy on June 6th, the true scale of the German miscalculation became visible. On the horizon, the sea was filled with the silhouettes of 5,000 ships, but the battle for the beaches was already being decided miles inland. At Utah Beach, the 4th Infantry Division began their ship-to-shore movement, expecting a bloodbath. Instead, as they waded through the surf and moved toward the critical causeways, they found them not bristling with German MG-42s, but held by haggard, mud-caked men in jumpsuits. The link-up was a moment of profound strategic relief. The Screaming Eagles, despite being scattered and losing over 60% of their heavy equipment in the jump, had successfully seized the exits. The German 91st Division, which should have been driving the Americans back into the sea, was instead paralyzed, fighting hundreds of small-scale, private wars in the hedgerows. German reinforcements arriving from the interior found themselves ambushed at every crossroads. The soft Americans had turned the French countryside into a labyrinth of lethal traps. By mid-morning, the German 7th Army's headquarters was in a state of total collapse. Reports were coming in that the Americans hadn't just dropped a few saboteurs. They had dropped an entire army corps into their backyard. The impenetrable Atlantic Wall was now a thin shell, being hammered from the front by naval guns and hollowed out from the back by paratroopers. The arrogance of the German officer corps had vanished, replaced by a frantic scramble to find a front line that simply did not exist. Every time a German unit attempted to organize a counterattack, they were cut down by snipers or dispersed by the sudden appearance of an American patrol that wasn't supposed to be there. The cost for the airborne, however, was staggering. The hedgerows were littered with the silk of parachutes and the bodies of young men who had died before they could even unhook their harnesses. In some units, the casualty rate exceeded 25% in the first few hours. But the objective had been achieved. By securing the bridges over the Murderette and the lock at La Barquette, the paratroopers had prevented the Germans from flooding the entire region. a move that would have trapped the Allied invasion on a narrow strip of sand. The amateurs had held the door open for the liberation of Europe, paid for in the blood of the boys from Toccoa. The strategic collapse of the German defense in the Cotentin Peninsula was not merely a failure of geography, but a psychological shattering of the Wehrmacht's command structure. By the evening of June 6th, the German 7th Army was facing a reality they had deemed impossible. Their coastal crust had been breached, and the elite 91st Air Landing Division, specifically trained to counter airborne operations, had been effectively decapitated. The death of General Falley and the loss of almost all battalion-level communications meant that the German backyard had become a vacuum of authority. The psychological shift was even more profound. German survivors of the night's fighting spoke with a new, fearful respect for their adversaries. The soft Americans they had been promised by propaganda were nowhere to be found. Instead, they described devils in baggy pants who fought with a ferocious, almost reckless autonomy. One captured German officer famously remarked that he knew the war was lost when he saw American paratroopers using specialized equipment and luxury items, like high-quality chocolate and cigarettes, that the German army hadn't seen in years. The industrial and personal softness they mocked was actually the byproduct of a logistical powerhouse that could afford to equip every soldier like a king. As the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions consolidated their gains, the long-term impact on the Normandy campaign became clear. By holding Saint-Miraglais and the Murderate bridges, the paratroopers had successfully isolated the major port city of Cherbourg. Without the airborne success, the German 243rd and 709th Static Divisions would have been able to reinforce the beach defenses, likely turning Utah Beach into a slaughterhouse rivaling Omaha. Instead, the Germans were forced onto the defensive in a series of brutal, close-quarters battles in the Bocage, the thick hedgerow country. The backyard drop also forced the German High Command to keep their vital panzer reserves held back, because they couldn't tell where the main American force was, since paratroopers were appearing behind every village. They hesitated to commit the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and the Panzer Lehr Division until it was far too late. The chaos sown by 13,000 men in the dark had created a strategic fog that blinded the German leadership, allowing the Allies to land over 150,000 men by the end of D-Day. The amateurs had not just survived, they had dismantled the pride of the Third Reich's western defenses in less than 24 hours. The fields of Normandy are quiet today. The stone walls of the chateaus that once echoed with the dismissive laughter of the German officer corps are now monuments to a night that redefined the nature of modern warfare. The soft Americans, the boys from the red clay of Georgia, the steel mills of Pennsylvania, and the streets of Brooklyn, had done more than just seize a few crossroads and bridges. They had shattered a myth of invincibility that the Third Reich had spent a decade constructing. Operation Neptune proved that no wall is high enough, and no water is deep enough to stop a force driven by the decentralized initiative of the individual soldier. The German tragedy in Normandy was a failure of imagination. They believed that war was a matter of rigid lines, concrete bunkers, and centralized commands. They forgot that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is not a Tiger tank or a concrete pillbox, but a soldier who knows how to think for himself when the maps are lost and the radios go silent. The legacy of the 1,000 paratroopers who dropped into that German backyard lives on in every modern airborne unit across the globe. They proved that the amateur in a democracy, when pushed to the brink, possesses a grit that no autocracy can manufacture. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, the world had changed. The Atlantic Wall was a ruin, the master race was in retreat, and the road to Berlin was open. The laughter of the officers had long since turned into the silence of the defeated, replaced by the steady, rhythmic clicking of American crickets echoing through the dark, a sound that signaled not just a tactical victory, but the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. History would remember them not as the soft civilians they were believed to be, but as the iron spearhead of a world that refused to be conquered.